Your son's plane went down. There are no survivors." The voice on the phone was calm, professional, the practiced tone of someone who had delivered bad news so many times that the words had lost their weight. I stood in my kitchen, the morning sun streaming through the windows in golden bars, my coffee growing cold on the counter beside the stack of bills I'd been sorting. The words didn't make sense. They were sounds without meaning, syllables that refused to arrange themselves into comprehensible thoughts. My hand tightened on the phone until my knuckles went white. "I'm Lorraine, and my son Marcus was a pilot for Atlantic Continental Airlines, had been a pilot. For 15 years, he'd flown routes across the country and around the world, sending me postcards from Tokyo and Paris and Sao Paulo, calling me from hotel rooms in cities I'd never visit to tell me about the food and the weather and the passengers who made him laugh. He was 42 years old, healthy and careful, and meticulous about his job in a way that bordered on obsession. He checked and double-checked everything, ran through his pre-flight routines with religious devotion, never took shortcuts or cut corners. He wasn't supposed to die in a plane crash. He wasn't supposed to die at all. Not before me. Not like this." "Mrs. Hamilton?" The voice on the phone was still speaking, patient and practiced. "Mrs. Hamilton? Are you there? Do you understand what I've told you?" "I'm here," I said. My voice came out as a whisper, barely audible even to myself. "I'm very sorry for your loss, ma'am. Truly sorry. A representative from the airline will be in touch within the next few hours to discuss arrangements and answer any questions you might have. Is there someone who can be with you right now? A family member or friend? We don't recommend being alone at a time like this. Someone who could be with me. My husband David had died 8 years ago, taken by a heart attack while mowing the lawn on a Sunday afternoon, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt too large for one person. My daughter Patricia lived in London with her husband and children, an ocean away. My sister was in a nursing home across town, her mind stolen by dementia, unable to recognize her own reflection in the mirror. There was no one. There was just me, alone in a kitchen that now felt impossibly vast, too bright with morning sunshine, too full of a future that would never include my son. "I'll be fine," I lied. "The way you lie to strangers who don't deserve your grief. Thank you for calling." I hung up and stood there for a long moment. The phone still pressed to my ear, even though the line was dead. Then my legs gave out, and I slid down the cabinet until I was sitting on the cold kitchen floor, my back against the dishwasher, staring at nothing while the world continued turning, indifferent to the fact that my only son was gone. The memorial service was held 5 days later at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, the same church where I'd been baptized as a baby and married as a young woman, and had buried my husband 8 years ago. The building was familiar in a way that felt both comforting and cruel. These walls had witnessed every major moment of my life, and now they were witnessing the worst one. Marcus's body hadn't been recovered from the crash site. The plane had gone down in a remote mountain region during a storm, visibility near zero, the terrain so rugged that rescue teams had taken 3 days just to reach the wreckage. The search teams were still working, they told me, still hoping to recover remains, but the fire had been intense and the conditions were challenging. I might never have anything to bury. So the casket at the front of the church was empty, a polished mahogany vessel containing only memories and grief and the unbearable weight of absence. I'd chosen the casket myself, had sat in the funeral director's office and paged through a catalog of options as if I were selecting furniture, as if the choice mattered, as if anything mattered now that my son was dead. The church was full, every pew was occupied, and people were standing along the walls, crowded into the narthex, spilling out onto the front steps. Marcus had been popular, well-liked by colleagues and friends, and the extended network of people who accumulate around a life well-lived. Pilots in their crisp uniforms filled the front pews on the right side, their caps removed in respect, their faces solemn. Flight attendants dabbed at their eyes with tissues, comparing memories of the kind and professional captain who always remembered their names. Neighbors I hadn't seen in years came forward to offer condolences and casseroles and the awkward comfort of shared grief. I sat in the front row on the left side, wearing the same black dress I'd bought for David's funeral 8 years ago. It still fit, more or less, though I'd had to let out the seams. Patricia had flown in from London the day after I called her with the news, leaving her husband to manage the children while she rushed to be by my side. She sat beside me now, holding my hand so tightly I could feel the bones grinding together, her face a mirror of my own devastation. The minister spoke about Marcus's life, reading from notes I'd provided, his childhood love of airplanes, his determination to become a pilot, his years of hard work and dedication. Friends and colleagues shared stories, some funny and some touching, painting a picture of a man who had been respected and admired and loved. I listened to all of it, as if from a great distance, the words washing over me without penetrating, my mind stuck in a loop of disbelief. And then a woman I'd never seen before walked up to me. She approached from the side aisle, moving hesitantly, as if unsure of her welcome. She was young, mid-30s, maybe, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and eyes red and swollen from crying. In her arms, she carried a little girl, perhaps 3 years old, with curly dark hair and skin the color of honey and a face that made my heart stop beating. Because I knew that face. I'd seen it in 1,000 photographs, in home movies and school portraits, and the reflection in my own mirror. It was Marcus's face, softened and feminized, but unmistakable, staring at me from the arms of a stranger. The child was clutching a stuffed airplane, the kind you buy at airport gift shops, and she was watching the empty casket with the confused solemnity of a child who doesn't quite understand what death means, but knows that something important has happened. "Mrs. Hamilton?" the woman said. Her voice was trembling, thick with tears. "I'm so sorry to approach you like this. I know this isn't the time or place, but I didn't know how else to reach you. And I couldn't just stay away. He would have wanted me here. He would have wanted you to know." "Do I know you?" I asked, though I was afraid I already understood the answer. "No," she said. "But you should. You should have known me years ago. I'm Valerie. I was Marcus's wife." The world stopped. The murmur of the mourners faded to silence. Patricia's hand tightened on mine. "That's not possible," I said. "Marcus wasn't married. He would have told me." "I know," Valerie said. "I know he kept me a secret, and I know how much that must hurt. But it's true. We've been married for 4 years. And this," she shifted the little girl in her arms. "This is Amelia, your granddaughter." I stared at the child, at her eyes, which were Marcus's eyes, deep brown and slightly hooded, at her chin, which was Marcus's chin, stubborn and slightly pointed, at the way she held that stuffed airplane, protective and possessive, the way Marcus had held his model planes when he was small. "I don't understand," I said. "Why would he hide you from me?" "It's complicated," Valerie said, "and I promise I'll explain everything. But first, I need to give you something." She reached into her purse and pulled out a white envelope, slightly crumpled, with my name written on the front in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. Marcus's handwriting. The same loops and slants I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists, and the note he'd left on my refrigerator the last time he'd visited, 3 months ago. "He asked me to give you this," Valerie said. "He said if anything ever happened to him, I should find you and make sure you got it. He said it was important." I took the envelope with shaking hands. It was sealed, the flap tucked carefully into the body, the way Marcus always sealed his letters, too impatient for the lick-and-stick method. "What is it?" I asked. "I don't know," Valerie said. "He never told me. He just said you needed to see it. If he died, he said you'd know what to do." I looked at Patricia, who was staring at Valerie and Amelia, with an expression I couldn't read. Then I looked back at the envelope in my hands, at my name in my dead son's handwriting, at the secrets it might contain. "Thank you," I said, "for bringing this, for coming here." Valerie nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I loved him," she said. "I know you don't know me, and I know this is all wrong, the way you're finding out, but I loved him, Mrs. Hamilton. And so did Amelia. He was a good father. He was a good husband. Whatever secrets he kept from you, please believe that." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of mourners with my granddaughter in her arms. I watched her go, clutching the envelope that might explain everything or nothing, wondering how many other secrets my son had taken to his grave. I didn't open the envelope until that night, after the last mourner had left, and Patricia had gone to bed in the guest room, and the house was quiet with the particular silence that follows death. I sat in my living room, in the chair where I'd read stories to Marcus when he was small, and I stared at my name in his handwriting until I couldn't stand it anymore. The envelope contained 3 items: The first was a handwritten note, 2 pages long, covered in Marcus's careful script. The second was a USB drive, small and black, with no label or marking. The third was a photograph of Marcus with Valerie and Amelia, all 3 of them smiling, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. I started with the note. "Mom," it began, "if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the secrets I kept. I'm sorry for the lies I told. I'm sorry for Valerie and Amelia, for hiding them from you all these years. You deserve to know about your granddaughter. You deserve to be part of her life. I was a coward, and I hope you can forgive me." I had to stop reading. The tears were coming too fast, blurring the words, making the page swim in front of my eyes. I wiped my face and forced myself to continue. "There's something else I need to tell you, something more important than my personal failures. For the past 2 years, I've been investigating irregularities in the maintenance records at Atlantic Continental. I've found evidence of falsified inspections, of shortcuts taken to save money, of planes flying with known mechanical issues that should have grounded them. I've documented everything on the USB drive I've enclosed with this letter. I've tried to report this through proper channels. I've talked to my supervisors, to the union, to the FAA. No one wants to listen. They say I'm paranoid, that I'm seeing problems where none exist, that I'm putting my career at risk for nothing. But I know what I've seen, Mom. I know what I've found, and I'm afraid that if I keep pushing, something bad is going to happen to me. If you're reading this letter, then my fears were justified. Whatever they told you about how I died, please don't believe it. Look at the evidence on the USB drive. Show it to someone you trust, a journalist, a lawyer, someone outside the airline industry. The truth needs to come out, even if I'm not around to tell it. I love you, Mom. I'm sorry I wasn't a better son. Please take care of Valerie and Amelia. They're going to need you. Marcus." I read the letter 3 times, trying to make sense of what my son was telling me. Falsified maintenance records, planes flying with mechanical issues, an investigation that had gotten him killed. This wasn't a plane crash. This was murder. I looked at the USB drive in my hand, this small piece of plastic that might contain evidence of crimes that had cost my son his life. Then I looked at the photograph of Marcus with his secret family, the wife and daughter he'd hidden from me for years. 2 mysteries, intertwined. 2 sets of secrets that demanded answers. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room, reading and rereading the letter, staring at the photograph, turning the USB drive over in my hands like a talisman. By the time the sun came up, I had made a decision. I was going to find out who killed my son, and I was going to make them pay. Patricia found me in the kitchen the next morning, still in the same clothes I'd worn to the memorial service, making coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Mom?" She looked at me with concern. "Did you sleep at all?" "No," I said. "I need to show you something." I told her everything, the letter, the USB drive, the accusations Marcus had made about the airline. Patricia listened in silence, her face growing paler with each revelation. "This is insane," she said, when I finished. "You're saying Marcus was murdered by his own airline?" "I'm saying that's what he believed," I said, "and I'm saying we need to find out if he was right." "Mom, this is..." Patricia shook her head. "This is too big for us. If what Marcus wrote is true, we're talking about corporate conspiracy, about people who are willing to kill to protect their secrets. We can't just investigate this ourselves. We need to go to the police." "And tell them what? That my dead son left me a letter, accusing his employer of murder. They'll think I'm a grieving mother who can't accept that her son died in an accident. They'll pat me on the head and send me home. Then we go to a journalist, or a lawyer, someone who can actually do something with this information." "We will," I said. "But first I need to know what's on that USB drive. I need to see the evidence Marcus collected. I need to understand what he found before I start making accusations I can't support." Patricia was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming on the kitchen table, her brow furrowed in thought. I could see her processing everything I'd told her, weighing the implications, calculating the risks. She'd always been the practical one, the daughter who thought 3 steps ahead while Marcus had charged forward on instinct and faith. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's see what's on the drive, but we need to be careful about this. If what Marcus wrote is true, if he really was killed because of what he knew, then the people who did it might be monitoring his contacts. They might be watching us right now. You're being paranoid, I said, though I didn't fully believe it. Marcus was being paranoid too, Patricia pointed out. And he ended up dead. I'd rather be paranoid and alive than careless, and she stopped, unable to finish the sentence. We went to my study, a small room at the back of the house that had been David's office when he was alive. I'd kept it mostly unchanged after his death, unable to bring myself to clear out his papers and files, and his old laptop still sat on the desk where he'd left it, covered now in a thin layer of dust. It was slow and outdated, running a version of Windows that Microsoft hadn't supported in years, but it still functioned. More importantly, it wasn't connected to the internet, which meant whatever we looked at couldn't be traced or monitored. I plugged in the USB drive with trembling fingers and waited while the ancient computer recognized the device. The familiar chime of a successful connection seemed too loud in the quiet room. The drive contained hundreds of files, far more than I'd expected, organized into folders with cryptic names that suggested Marcus had developed his own classification system. MX_records_2022, incident_reports_falsified, internal_memos_confidential, flight_data_discrepancies, whistleblower_attempts, email_chains_executive. I clicked on the first folder, labeled overview_start_here, and found a single document, a summary Marcus had written, explaining what all the other files contained and how he'd obtained them. I've been collecting this evidence for 2 years, the document began. What started as a nagging suspicion has grown into documented proof of systematic fraud that puts thousands of lives at risk every single day. I've tried to report these problems through proper channels to my supervisors, to the union, to the FAA's whistleblower program, and every time I've been shut down. The airline has powerful friends. The regulators are captured by the industry they're supposed to oversee. Nobody wants to hear what I have to say, but the evidence doesn't lie. And eventually, someone is going to listen. I spent the next 3 hours reading through the files, with Patricia beside me, both of us growing more horrified with each document we opened. Marcus had documented a pattern of systematic fraud going back at least 5 years, possibly longer, maintenance inspections that had been signed off as completed without ever being performed, mechanics who claimed they'd checked hydraulic systems and landing gear and engine components that the flight records showed they'd never touched, parts that had been listed as replaced but were actually still in service, worn down to dangerous levels, held together by prayers and wishful thinking, safety warnings from manufacturers that had been received by the airline and then buried, never shared with the mechanics or pilots who needed to know about them. The internal memos were the most damning, emails between senior executives discussing how to manage the maintenance backlog without actually addressing it. Spreadsheets showing cost-benefit analyses that calculated how much it would cost to fix the problems versus how much the airline would pay in settlements if a plane went down, and concluding that the settlements were cheaper. Meeting minutes from board sessions where directors had voted to defer safety upgrades in favor of stock buybacks and executive bonuses. "My God," Patricia whispered, her face pale in the glow of the computer screen. "This is criminal. This isn't just negligence. This is deliberate. They knew people could die, and they decided the money was more important." "It gets worse," I said grimly. "Look at this." I pulled up a folder labeled recent_incidents_cross_reference. Inside were records of 3 crashes in the past 2 years, a cargo plane that had gone down in the Pacific, a regional jet that had crashed during landing in Denver, and a commuter flight that had disappeared over the Gulf of Mexico. Each crash had been officially attributed to pilot error or weather conditions, but Marcus had cross-referenced each incident with maintenance records showing that the planes had known mechanical issues that had been flagged by pilots and mechanics and then ignored by management. "He was building a criminal case," Patricia said. "He was documenting everything so that when he went public, nobody could deny it." "And they found out," I said. "They found out what he was doing, and they killed him for it." "We don't know that for certain," Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I know it," I said. "I feel it. Marcus was too careful, too meticulous, to die in a random accident. Someone sabotaged that plane. Someone at Atlantic Continental decided that my son's life was worth less than their stock price. We sat in silence, staring at the evidence Marcus had gathered, at the proof of crimes that had cost him everything. The scope of it was overwhelming. Atlantic Continental was one of the largest airlines in the country, with thousands of employees, hundreds of aircraft, millions of passengers every year. The executives whose names appeared in these emails were powerful people, connected to politicians and lobbyists and the vast machinery of corporate America. Taking them on would be like fighting a war against an enemy with unlimited resources and no conscience. But Marcus had been willing to fight that war. He'd spent 2 years gathering ammunition, preparing for a battle he knew might cost him everything, and now he was dead. And the ammunition was in my hands, and I had to decide what to do with it. "We need to make copies," I said finally. "Multiple copies, stored in different places, with people we trust. If something happens to us—" "Mom, don't." "If something happens to us," I repeated firmly, "the evidence has to survive." That's what Marcus wanted. That's why he gave this to me. The truth needs to come out, even if we're not around to tell it. We spent the next 4 hours making copies of the USB drive, burning the files onto DVDs, saving them to multiple flash drives, even printing out the most critical documents on paper. We stored one copy in the safety deposit box at my bank, the one that held David's life insurance papers and my will. We mailed another copy to Patricia's address in London, using a fake return address so it couldn't be traced back to us. We hid a third copy in a place only I would think to look, inside a hollowed-out copy of my mother's Bible, on the bookshelf in the living room. We were being paranoid, but paranoia seemed appropriate, given what we'd learned about the people we were dealing with. That evening, I called Valerie. She answered on the third ring, her voice weary and tired, like someone who had spent too many nights crying and not enough time sleeping. "Mrs. Hamilton?" She sounded uncertain, as if she wasn't sure I would ever want to speak to her again. "We need to talk," I said, "face to face, not on the phone. There are things I need to understand, and things you need to know. Can you come to my house tomorrow morning?" There was a long pause. I could hear Amelia in the background, chattering about something, probably the stuffed airplane, which she apparently carried everywhere. "Is everything okay?" Valerie asked. "Has something happened?" "Yes," I said. "I found out why Marcus kept you a secret. I found out what he was involved in, what he was trying to do, and I think you deserve to know the full story, not just the parts he told you, but all of it." Another pause, longer this time. When Valerie spoke again, her voice was trembling. "I've wanted to understand," she said. "For years I've wanted to understand why he couldn't just tell the world about us, why he made me promise to keep our marriage secret, why he was so afraid all the time. He never explained it to me. He just said it was for our protection, and I was supposed to trust him." "I know," I said. "I understand now. Come tomorrow, and I'll tell you everything." Valerie arrived the next morning at 9 o'clock, with Amelia drowsy in her arms. The little girl had apparently been up late the night before, too excited about meeting her grandmother again to sleep. I took them into the living room and made tea, going through the familiar motions of hospitality while my mind raced with everything I needed to say. When we were all settled, Valerie on the couch with Amelia beside her, me in the armchair across from them, I told her what I'd found on the USB drive. I told her about the maintenance fraud, the falsified inspections, the corporate cover-up that had put thousands of lives at risk. I told her about Marcus's investigation, his attempts to report the problems through official channels, the walls he'd encountered at every turn. And I told her about his fear, the fear that had driven him to hide his family, to keep his marriage secret, to live a double life that must have been exhausting and isolating and terrifying. "He was protecting you," I said, when I finished. "The same way he tried to protect me by not telling me about you. He knew that if the airline found out he was gathering evidence against them, they might retaliate. They might go after the people he loved. He thought that by keeping you hidden, by making sure no one connected you to him, he could keep you safe." Valerie was crying quietly, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed what I was telling her. Amelia had fallen asleep, with her head in her mother's lap, exhausted from the late night and the emotional morning. "He never told me any of this," Valerie said. "He said there were things he couldn't talk about, things related to his work, things that were dangerous, but he never explained what they were. I thought. She stopped, shaking her head. I thought maybe he was ashamed of me. Maybe he didn't want his family to know he'd married someone like me. Someone who didn't come from money, who didn't have a fancy career, who was just a waitress at a diner when we met. That's not it at all, I said firmly. He loved you. Anyone who saw you together could see that. He kept you secret because he was terrified of what might happen to you if the wrong people found out. The people he was investigating, they've already proven they're willing to kill to protect their secrets. Marcus knew that. He was trying to keep you and Amelia out of the line of fire. But they killed him anyway, Valerie said bitterly. He tried to protect us, and they killed him anyway. And now Amelia is going to grow up without a father because some corporation decided their profit margins were more important than human life. Yes, I said. They killed him. But they're not going to get away with it. The evidence Marcus collected is going to bring them down. The whole world is going to know what they did, and they're going to pay for it. Is that supposed to make me feel better? Valerie asked. Her voice was harsh, raw with grief. Is justice supposed to bring him back? Is accountability supposed to make up for the fact that my daughter is never going to know her father, that I'm going to spend the rest of my life missing him, that everything we planned together, the house we were going to buy, the siblings we were going to give Amelia, the life we were going to build, all of that is gone now? No, I said quietly. Nothing is going to bring him back. Nothing is going to make up for what we've lost, but making sure the truth comes out, making sure the people who killed him face consequences, that's what Marcus wanted. That's what he died for. If we honor that, if we finish what he started, then at least his death will have meant something. At least his sacrifice won't have been in vain. Valerie was quiet for a long time, looking down at her sleeping daughter, stroking Amelia's curly dark hair with gentle fingers. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier, more determined. What do you need me to do? She asked. How can I help? Right now, I need you to be safe, I said. I need you to keep Amelia safe. The investigation is going to take time, weeks, maybe months, and until the truth comes out, the people who killed Marcus might still be dangerous. Stay with me if you want, or go somewhere else, somewhere they won't think to look for you. But be careful, be vigilant, and be ready to tell your story when the time comes. My story. The story of who Marcus really was. Not just the pilot, not just the whistleblower, but the husband and father. The man who loved you so much, he was willing to give up everything. His relationship with his mother, his connection to his family, his normal life, just to keep you safe. That's a story that needs to be told too. That's a story that will help people understand what he sacrificed and why it mattered. Valerie nodded slowly, her jaw set with new resolve. I'll tell it, she said. When the time comes, I'll tell everyone who Marcus really was. I'll make sure Amelia knows too. I'll make sure she understands that her father was a hero. Thank you, I said. That's all I can ask. We sat together for a long while after that, the three of us, grandmother, daughter-in-law, granddaughter, bound together by grief and love, and the shared determination to see justice done. Amelia woke up eventually, confused and cranky, and I found myself smiling for the first time in what felt like forever, as I watched her explore my living room, investigating the photographs on the mantel and the books on the shelves with the fearless curiosity of a 3-year-old. This was my family now, not the family I'd expected, not the family I'd planned for, but the family I had, and I was grateful for them. Grateful for Valerie's strength, grateful for Amelia's presence, grateful for the chance to know my granddaughter, even though I'd lost my son. It wasn't enough to heal the wound of Marcus's death. Nothing ever would be, but it was something to hold on to, something to build on, something to give me hope for the future, even as I mourned the past. Robert Chen agreed to meet me the next day at a coffee shop in the city, a quiet place in an older neighborhood where business people came for meetings they didn't want overheard. He was a small man, wiry and intense, with graying hair cut short and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that seemed to miss nothing. He'd come alone, carrying only a leather messenger bag and the wary demeanor of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. I recognized him from the aviation safety conference where we'd met 5 years ago. Marcus had introduced us, proud to know someone who'd worked at the NTSB, someone who understood the importance of safety in an industry where mistakes cost lives. Robert had been skeptical then, frustrated by the bureaucracy and politics that prevented real reform. Now, according to his reputation, he channeled that frustration into action, taking on cases that the official agencies wouldn't touch. He listened without interrupting, while I laid out what Marcus had discovered, occasionally asking questions or requesting clarification, his expression growing grimmer with each new revelation. I'd brought a copy of the USB drive, along with printed summaries of the most damning documents, and I slid them across the table as I talked. When I finished, Robert sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples as if fighting off a headache. "Your son was onto something big," he said finally. "Really big. If even half of what he documented is accurate, Atlantic Continental has been engaged in systematic fraud that puts thousands of lives at risk every single day. We're talking about one of the largest airlines in the country, with a fleet of over 500 aircraft, carrying more than 80 million passengers a year. The scale of potential harm here is almost incomprehensible." "Can you help us?" I asked. "Can you investigate this?" "I can try," he said carefully. "But I want you to understand exactly what we're up against. Atlantic Continental isn't just another corporation. They're one of the most powerful players in the aviation industry, with decades of accumulated influence. They have lobbyists on Capitol Hill who've helped write the laws that regulate them. They have former executives in senior positions at the FAA and the Department of Transportation. They have lawyers, armies of lawyers, who specialize in making problems like this disappear. They've been successfully suppressing whistleblowers for as long as the company has existed." "My son was a whistleblower," I said, "and they killed him." "Maybe," Robert said. "Probably, but probably isn't going to hold up in court. We need evidence, hard, irrefutable evidence that links his death directly to the fraud he was exposing. The documents on this USB drive are a good start, but they're not enough. They prove corporate negligence, maybe even corporate manslaughter. They don't prove that anyone specifically ordered Marcus's plane to be sabotaged." "So what do we do?" "We investigate," Robert said. "Carefully, methodically, without tipping our hand. I have contacts, former colleagues, at the NTSB, people at the FAA who haven't been completely captured by the industry, journalists who've been wanting to dig into aviation safety for years. If we can verify the evidence Marcus collected and connect it to his death, we can build a case that even Atlantic Continental won't be able to suppress." "How long will it take?" I asked. "Weeks, maybe months. These things move slowly, especially when powerful people are trying to stop them. We'll need to cross-reference every document, verify every claim, build a paper trail that proves the fraud was systematic and intentional. And we'll need to find someone inside the company who's willing to talk, a current employee who can confirm that the cover-up is ongoing, that the problems Marcus documented haven't been fixed." "Months," I repeated, feeling the weight of the word. I wasn't young anymore. Every day felt precious. But I also understood that rushing would only play into the airline's hands. They were counting on the story dying with Marcus, on the evidence disappearing, on the world moving on. The best revenge I could take was patience. "Do whatever you need to do," I said. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Promise me that when this is over, everyone will know the truth. Everyone will know what Atlantic Continental did, and what my son sacrificed to expose them." Robert reached across the table and shook my hand, his grip firm and steady. "I promise," he said. "Your son was a hero, Mrs. Hamilton. He had the courage to stand up against powerful people who were putting lives at risk. That kind of courage is rare. The world is going to know about it." The investigation took 4 months. 4 months of phone calls at odd hours and meetings in parking garages and sleepless nights waiting for news. Robert and his team pored over the evidence Marcus had collected, verifying every document against official records, building a timeline of the fraud that stretched back more than a decade. They found additional sources: mechanics who'd been pressured to sign off on incomplete inspections, pilots who'd filed safety complaints that had been ignored, mid-level managers who'd witnessed executives making decisions they knew were dangerous. Meanwhile, I kept expecting Atlantic Continental to find out what we were doing. I checked my rearview mirror constantly, looking for cars that might be following me. I had my phone checked for tracking software, My house swept for bugs. Robert thought I was being paranoid. Maybe I was, but my son had been paranoid too, and his paranoia had turned out to be justified. The break came in the 4th month, when one of Robert's contacts at the FAA agreed to formally review the evidence Marcus had collected. Her name was Linda Ortiz, a senior investigator with 30 years of experience who had grown increasingly frustrated with the agency's unwillingness to challenge the airlines she was supposed to regulate. She'd seen too many investigations get buried for political reasons, too many safety violations swept under the rug because the airlines had powerful friends. When Robert approached her with our case, she'd been reluctant at first. Another conspiracy theory, she'd assumed, another grieving family looking for someone to blame, but the evidence changed her mind. She spent 2 weeks going through the files, cross-referencing them with official records she could access through her position at the FAA. What she found confirmed everything Marcus had suspected, and worse. "It's real," she told Robert, in a phone call I was allowed to listen to, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear her words. "The maintenance fraud, the falsified inspections, the cover-ups at the executive level, it's all real, and it's even more extensive than your whistleblower realized. We're looking at systemic failures affecting the entire fleet, going back at least 15 years. There are planes flying right now, today with mechanical issues that should have grounded them. People are boarding those planes, trusting the airline to keep them safe, and the airline knows, they know that the planes aren't airworthy." "What about Marcus's crash?" Robert asked. "Is there evidence of sabotage?" "I can't say for certain yet," Linda said carefully. "The official investigation attributed the crash to pilot error, specifically to Marcus's failure to respond appropriately to a mechanical emergency. But the maintenance records for that aircraft show a pattern of deferred repairs that's consistent with what we've found across the fleet. The plane had outstanding hydraulic issues, warning indicators that had been malfunctioning for months, problems that should have been fixed but kept getting pushed back because of cost concerns. If those issues contributed to the crash, then someone at Atlantic Continental is criminally responsible for your son's death." "What happens now?" I asked, unable to stay silent any longer. "Now we go public," Linda said. "I'm going to recommend that the FAA open a formal investigation into Atlantic Continental's maintenance practices. I'm going to recommend that every plane in their fleet be grounded until they can be properly inspected by independent mechanics. And I'm going to recommend that the Department of Justice look into criminal charges against the executives who authorized this fraud." "Will they listen?" I asked. "Will they actually do something? Or will this just get buried like everything else?" "They'll have to listen this time," Linda said, and there was steel in her voice. "I'm putting my career on the line here. I'm putting my reputation, my pension, everything I've worked for in 30 years at this agency. But your son died trying to expose the truth. Mrs. Hamilton, he was braver than most of the people I work with. I'm not going to let his sacrifice be for nothing." The story broke 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in late October. A reporter at the Washington Post, Emily Chen, one of Robert's most trusted contacts, a Pulitzer Prize winner who had built her career on investigative journalism that held powerful institutions accountable, published a front-page investigation detailing the maintenance fraud at Atlantic Continental. The headline screamed across the top of the paper in bold black letters, "Deadly Negligence: How America's Largest Airline Put Profits Over Passenger Safety for a Decade." The article ran 12,000 words, with supporting documents, internal memos, photographs, and interviews with dozens of sources who had come forward after Emily had guaranteed their anonymity. Marcus's story was at the center of it all. Emily had interviewed me extensively, and I'd given her permission to use quotes from his letter, to describe the evidence he'd gathered, to paint a portrait of a man who had seen something wrong and refused to stay silent. She'd interviewed Valerie, too, and Linda Ortiz and Robert Chen, and mechanics and pilots who had witnessed the fraud firsthand. The picture that emerged was devastating, a corporation so consumed by greed that it had systematically endangered the lives of the millions of passengers who trusted it to fly them safely. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming, like a dam breaking after years of accumulated pressure. Atlantic Continental's stock price crashed within hours of the story's publication, dropping 40% before trading was halted. The CEO resigned that afternoon, issuing a brief statement that expressed regret for any failures in our safety protocols, without actually admitting wrongdoing. The FAA announced a formal investigation before the day was out, and by the end of the week, the entire fleet, over 500 aircraft, had been grounded pending comprehensive safety inspections. Congress scheduled hearings. The Department of Justice announced a criminal investigation. Aviation experts appeared on cable news channels around the clock, analyzing the evidence and speculating about how deep the corruption went. The airline's name became synonymous with corporate greed and criminal negligence, a cautionary tale that would be taught in business schools for decades to come. And Marcus became a hero. The media called him a whistleblower, a martyr, a man who had given his life to protect the traveling public. His photograph was everywhere, the official portrait from his pilot's license, showing a handsome man in his uniform, serious and competent and trustworthy. Reporters tracked down his colleagues, his friends, anyone who could speak to his character and his courage. They told stories about the captain, who always remembered flight attendants' names, who took extra care with nervous passengers, who treated every flight like it mattered because to him it did. I did interviews too. More interviews than I could count, with journalists from newspapers and magazines and television networks, all of them wanting to hear from the mother of the man who had exposed Atlantic Continental's crimes. I told Marcus's story as honestly as I could, acknowledging his flaws alongside his virtues, explaining the secrets he'd kept and the reasons he'd kept them. I wanted people to understand that he hadn't been a perfect man. He'd been human, complicated, capable of mistakes. But when the moment of truth came, when he had to choose between his own safety and doing what was right, he had chosen right. Marcus knew what he was risking. I told Emily Chen in a follow-up interview that ran the day after the initial story broke. He knew that the people he was exposing were powerful and ruthless. He knew they might come after him, but he did it anyway, because he couldn't live with himself if he stayed silent while innocent people died. That's the kind of man he was. That's the legacy he left behind. Valerie spoke publicly too. For the first time, she appeared on morning news programs with Amelia beside her, telling the story of their secret marriage and the fears that had driven Marcus to keep his family hidden. She was eloquent and composed, heartbreaking in her grief, but firm in her determination to honor her husband's memory. Marcus didn't want to be a hero, Valerie said in one interview that went viral. He wanted to be a husband and father. He wanted to come home after his flights and play with his daughter and live a normal, quiet life. But when he saw what Atlantic Continental was doing, when he understood that people were dying because the airline cared more about profits than safety, he couldn't stay silent. He gave up everything, his career, his privacy, eventually his life, to tell the truth. The least we can do is make sure that truth doesn't die with him. The interview brought millions of people to tears. It also brought federal investigators to our doorstep, asking questions about Marcus's evidence and how to find more. The wheels of justice were finally turning, and they were turning fast. Robert Chen's contacts at the NTSB reopened the investigation into Marcus's crash. With the new context provided by his evidence, they were looking at the accident differently, not as pilot error, but as potential sabotage. The maintenance records for the aircraft showed the same pattern of deferred repairs and falsified inspections that Marcus had documented across the fleet. If those mechanical issues had contributed to the crash, then someone at Atlantic Continental was criminally responsible for his death. The answer came 3 months later, when investigators recovered new evidence from the crash site, physical proof that a critical hydraulic component had failed, a component that had been flagged for replacement months earlier, but never actually fixed. The official cause of death was revised from pilot error to mechanical failure due to deferred maintenance. Marcus hadn't made a mistake. He had been murdered, as surely as if someone had put a gun to his head, by executives who had decided that fixing a safety issue was too expensive. Linda Ortiz called me with the news. "We got them," she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "We have proof, physical, irrefutable proof, that the mechanical failure was caused by negligent maintenance. The Department of Justice is going to add murder charges to the indictment. The executives who made those decisions are going to face justice, not just for fraud, but for your son's death specifically." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, the phone pressed to my ear, tears streaming down my face. "Thank you," I managed to say. "Thank you for not giving up." "Your son didn't give up," Linda said. "Neither could I." The criminal trial began the following year, in a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. The government had assembled a team of prosecutors from the Department of Justice's Fraud Division, attorneys who specialized in taking on powerful corporations and the executives who ran them. They'd built their case methodically, using Marcus's evidence as the foundation and adding layer upon layer of additional documentation, testimony from whistleblowers inside the company, financial records subpoenaed from banks in 3 countries, forensic analysis of the maintenance records that proved they'd been systematically falsified. 12 executives from Atlantic Continental were charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, violations of federal aviation safety regulations, and in the cases of the CEO and the Chief Operations Officer, involuntary manslaughter for the deaths that had resulted from their decisions. The charges carried potential sentences of decades in prison. For the first time in the airline's history, the people at the top were being held personally accountable for the culture of negligence they had created. I attended every day of the trial. Every single day, from the opening statements in March to the closing arguments in June. I sat in the gallery with Valerie and Amelia, watching as the prosecutors laid out the evidence Marcus had died to collect. I listened as witness after witness testified about the pressure they'd faced to cut corners, the threats they'd received when they tried to report problems, the fear that had kept them silent for years. I watched the defendants, men in expensive suits with expensive lawyers, men who had made millions while gambling with human lives, sit impassively as their crimes were detailed for the jury and the world. The defense lawyers tried everything. They attacked Marcus's credibility, suggesting that he'd been a disgruntled employee with a grudge against the company, that he'd fabricated evidence to support his theories, that his death had been exactly what the official investigation concluded, a tragic mistake by a man who should have been better at his job. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that the prosecutors had failed to prove intent, that their clients had been acting in good faith based on information they'd been given by subordinates. None of it worked. The evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too clear, the crimes too well documented. Marcus had done his job too well. He created a record so detailed, so comprehensive, so impossible to dismiss, that even the best lawyers in the country couldn't explain it away. The most powerful moment came near the end of the trial, when the prosecution called me as a witness. I'd been prepared for this. The prosecutors had spent hours going over my testimony, making sure I understood what they needed me to say and how to say it. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality of sitting in that witness box, looking out at the faces of the men who had killed my son, and telling the world what they had done. Mrs. Hamilton, the lead prosecutor, said, "Can you describe for the jury how you first learned about your son's investigation into Atlantic Continental?" I told them about the letter, about reading Marcus's words for the first time in my living room, while the rest of the world slept, about the USB drive and the hundreds of files it contained, about the moment I'd realized that my son hadn't died in an accident, that he'd been murdered by people who valued their profits more than human life. "And what did you do when you understood what your son had discovered?" the prosecutor asked. I decided to finish what he started. I said, "He wrote in his letter that the truth needed to come out, even if he wasn't around to tell it, so I found people who could help me tell it. Robert Chen, Linda Ortiz, the reporters who broke the story. I did what Marcus would have done. I refused to let them win." I looked at the defendants as I said it. At the CEO, at the operations officer, at the board members and vice presidents who had signed off on decisions they knew were dangerous. Most of them wouldn't meet my eyes, but the CEO did. He stared at me with an expression I couldn't read, contempt, maybe, or something that might have been shame. "Do you have anything else you'd like to say to the jury?" the prosecutor asked. I paused, gathering my thoughts. This was the moment I'd been preparing for since the day I'd opened Marcus's letter, the moment when I could speak directly to the people who would decide whether justice would be done. "My son was a good man," I said. "He wasn't perfect. He kept secrets from me, made choices I wish he'd made differently. But when it mattered most, when he saw something wrong and had to decide whether to speak up or stay silent, he chose to speak up. He chose to risk everything. His career, his safety, his life, to protect people he would never meet. That's the kind of man he was. That's the kind of courage these defendants were counting on people not having. They were counting on everyone being too scared, too selfish, too comfortable to challenge them. Marcus wasn't scared. He wasn't selfish. He wasn't willing to be comfortable while innocent people died. And that's why they killed him." I had to stop. The tears were coming too fast, choking my voice, but I forced myself to continue. "I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me," I said. "I'm asking you to hold these men accountable for what they did. Not just for Marcus, but for everyone who boarded one of their planes, trusting that someone was making sure they were safe. These defendants betrayed that trust. They knew people could die, and they decided the money was more important. That's not just negligence. That's not just fraud. That's murder. And it's time someone said so." The courtroom was silent when I finished. Even the defense lawyers had nothing to say. I stepped down from the witness box and walked back to my seat beside Valerie and Amelia, my heart pounding, my hands shaking, knowing that I had said everything I needed to say. The jury deliberated for 3 days. 3 days of waiting, of pacing, of checking my phone every few minutes for news that never came. Valerie and Patricia took turns staying with me, making sure I ate, making sure I slept, making sure I didn't fall apart before the verdict came in. When the call finally came, I was in my kitchen, making coffee I didn't want, trying to fill the time with routine. The prosecutor's voice was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "The jury has reached a verdict," she said. "We're reconvening in 1 hour." I drove to the courthouse in a daze, barely aware of the traffic, the other cars, the world outside my windshield. Valerie met me at the entrance with Amelia, who was old enough now to understand that something important was happening. Patricia had flown in from London the night before, unwilling to miss the moment we'd all been waiting for. Robert Chen was there, and Linda Ortiz, and the reporters who had helped break the story. We filed into the courtroom together, a small army of people united by a shared commitment to the truth. The foreman stood when the judge called for the verdict. He was a middle-aged man with a tired face and a wedding ring that caught the fluorescent light. He held the verdict form in hands that trembled slightly. On the first count, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, the foreman read, "We find the defendants guilty." The word echoed through the courtroom. Guilty. I grabbed Valerie's hand, afraid to breathe. On the second count, wire fraud, we find the defendants guilty. On the third count, violations of federal aviation safety regulations, we find the defendants guilty. On the fourth count, involuntary manslaughter. The foreman paused, and I felt my heart stop. "We find the defendants guilty." Guilty. All 12 defendants, on all counts. The courtroom erupted, gasps and cheers, and the sound of cameras clicking as reporters captured the moment for posterity. I sat frozen in my seat, tears streaming down my face, unable to speak, unable to move, overwhelmed by a wave of emotion that I couldn't have named if I tried. Justice. After everything, after the secrets and the lies and the years of fighting, justice had finally been done. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. The judge, a stern-faced woman who had presided over some of the most complex corporate fraud cases in federal court history, delivered a speech that I would remember for the rest of my life. "The defendants before me today are not ordinary criminals," she said. "They are not desperate people, driven to crime by circumstance or poverty. They are wealthy, educated, powerful individuals who had every advantage that society can offer. And they used those advantages to commit crimes that endangered millions of innocent people. They knew their decisions could kill. They made those decisions anyway, and when a brave man tried to expose what they were doing, they silenced him, permanently." She turned to face the defendants, her expression cold. "Mr. Dawson," she said, addressing the CEO. "You were the leader of this conspiracy. You set the tone, made the final decisions, and profited the most from the fraud you orchestrated. For your crimes, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison." 25 years. I heard Valerie gasp beside me. The CEO's face went pale. The judge continued down the line, handing out sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. The chief operations officer received 20 years. The board members who had approved the cost-cutting measures received 15. Even the lower-level executives, the ones who had argued they were just following orders, received sentences of at least a decade. When it was over, when the last defendant had been led away in handcuffs, I stood in the courtroom and looked around at the empty chairs where the executives had sat, at the evidence that had been laid out for the jury, at the faces of the people who had fought beside me for years. Marcus wasn't there to see it, but I knew somehow that he was watching, that he was proud of what we'd accomplished in his name. We had won. Against all odds, against the most powerful corporation in the airline industry, against lawyers and lobbyists and the entire machinery of corporate America, we had won. And the world finally knew the truth. The years after the trial were quieter, marked by the slow rhythms of recovery and rebuilding. Atlantic Continental went bankrupt within months of the verdict, its reputation destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. The name that had once adorned the sides of hundreds of aircraft and the walls of airports across the country was erased, sold off piece by piece to competitors who wanted the routes and gates but wanted nothing to do with the legacy of fraud and death. The planes were grounded, inspected by independent mechanics, and either repaired or scrapped. The executives served their sentences in federal prisons, scattered across the country, their careers and reputations destroyed, their names forever associated with one of the worst corporate scandals in American history. The families of crash victims received settlements, substantial amounts, negotiated by lawyers who specialized in aviation disaster cases. The money couldn't bring back the people who had died, couldn't heal the wounds that would never fully close, but it acknowledged the wrong that had been done. It said, in the only language corporations truly understand, that there were consequences for putting profits ahead of human life. Valerie moved to a house, 3 streets away from mine, close enough that Amelia could walk over after school, close enough that I could watch my granddaughter grow up the way I'd watched Marcus grow up decades ago. The little girl who had clutched a stuffed airplane at her father's memorial became a bright, curious child who asked endless questions about everything, about the world, about history, about science and nature, and the mysteries of human behavior. She wanted to know about her father, of course, and I told her everything I could remember, the stories from his childhood, the dreams he'd had, the man he'd been before the secrets, and the crusade that had consumed his final years. I told her about the good parts. Mostly, the parts that showed who Marcus really was beneath the complications and contradictions, how he'd learned to ride a bicycle on the same driveway where she now practiced her skateboarding, how he'd spent hours building model airplanes in his room, dreaming of the day he'd fly real ones, how he'd worked 3 jobs to pay for flight school, too proud to ask for help, too determined to let anything stop him, how he'd called me every Sunday without fail, no matter where in the world his roots had taken him, just to hear my voice and tell me about his week. I told her about the hard parts too. Eventually, about the secrets he'd kept, the family he'd hidden, the wife and daughter he'd loved, but couldn't acknowledge publicly because he was afraid of what the airline might do to them, about the investigation that had consumed him, the evidence he'd gathered, the whistleblowing that had cost him everything. I wanted her to understand that her father had been human, flawed and complicated and capable of mistakes, but that when the moment of truth came, when he had to choose between his own safety and doing what was right, he had chosen right. She understood, I think. Children often understand more than we give them credit for. Patricia visited from London as often as she could manage, and when she did, we'd sit together in my living room, drinking tea and talking about Marcus and David and all the people we had loved and lost. She had been skeptical at first, reluctant to believe that her brother's death was anything more than a tragic accident. But she'd seen the evidence, watched the trial, listened to the testimony of witnesses who confirmed everything Marcus had suspected. Now she was one of my strongest advocates, helping me navigate the ongoing aftermath of the case, the media requests, the speaking invitations, the foundation we'd established in Marcus's name to support aviation safety whistleblowers. The Marcus Hamilton Foundation grew slowly but steadily over the years. We funded research into aviation safety, provided legal support for whistleblowers facing retaliation, and lobbied for stronger regulations to prevent the kind of fraud that had killed my son. Every year, on the anniversary of the crash, we held a ceremony to honor Marcus and the other victims, not just of his crash, but of all the crashes that had resulted from Atlantic Continental's negligence. The ceremony grew larger each year, as more families learned about our work and wanted to be part of it. I started speaking publicly about what had happened at aviation conferences, at corporate ethics seminars, at journalism schools and law schools and anywhere else that would have me. I told Marcus's story over and over, not because I enjoyed the attention, I'd never sought the spotlight, never wanted to be a public figure, but because I believed the story needed to be told. Every time a young pilot heard about what my son had sacrificed and decided to speak up about safety concerns instead of staying silent, Every time a corporate executive thought twice about cutting corners because they'd seen what happened to the executives at Atlantic Continental. Every time a potential whistleblower found the courage to come forward because they knew there were people who would support them. That was Marcus's legacy. That was the good that came from his death. On the 5th anniversary of the crash, we held a memorial at the site where Marcus's plane had gone down. The remote mountain meadow had been transformed over the years. A small road now led to the site, and a proper memorial had been constructed. Not just the simple bronze plaque we'd installed initially, but a larger monument with the names of all the crew members who had died, surrounded by a garden that bloomed with wildflowers in the summer. Valerie and Amelia were there, of course. Patricia and her family had flown in from London. Robert Chen attended, along with Linda Ortiz and several of the journalists who had helped break the story. The prosecutors who had tried the case came, and some of the jurors and families of other crash victims who had found closure through the trial. We gathered around the monument as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and we remembered the man who had brought us all together. Amelia, now 8 years old, placed a bouquet of wild flowers at the base of the monument. She'd picked them herself from the meadow, carefully selecting each bloom, arranging them with the seriousness of a child performing a sacred ritual. "I love you, Daddy," she said softly. "I miss you every day, but Grandma says you're a hero, and I believe her. I'm going to make you proud. I promise." I placed my hand on her shoulder, feeling her warmth through my fingers, grateful beyond words for this child who was the living proof that Marcus's life had meant something beyond the tragedy of his death. "He loved you too," I told her, "more than anything in the world, and he would be so proud of the person you're becoming." We stood there until the last light faded and the first stars appeared, watching the monument glow in the twilight, feeling the presence of the man we had lost and the legacy he had left behind. Then we walked back to our cars and drove away, leaving Marcus's memory to rest in that peaceful meadow, knowing that his story would continue to be told long after we were gone. The years have passed now. The house is quiet, most days, filled with the particular silence that settles over a life lived mostly alone. But it's not a lonely silence. Amelia visits after school, 3 days a week, filling the rooms with noise and energy and the boundless curiosity of a child discovering the world. She wants to be a pilot, like her father has wanted it since she was old enough to understand what pilots do, and I haven't tried to discourage her. The skies are safer now, because of what Marcus did, because of the regulations that were strengthened, and the oversight that was improved, and the culture of accountability that his sacrifice helped create. I have to believe they'll be safe enough for his daughter. Sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I take out the letter Marcus wrote and read it again. The paper is worn now, soft and fragile from being folded and unfolded so many times. The creases are deep, the edges frayed, the ink slightly faded, but the words are still clear, still powerful, still a reminder of who my son was and what he believed in. "The truth needs to come out," he wrote, "even if I'm not around to tell it." He was right. The truth did come out. It came out in newspaper headlines and courtroom testimony, in prison sentences and corporate bankruptcies, in the faces of jurors who heard the evidence and decided that enough was enough. Everyone knows now what Atlantic Continental did, what they tried to hide, what they were willing to kill to protect. Marcus's name is synonymous with courage and integrity, with the willingness to stand up against powerful forces even when the personal cost is everything. He wasn't a perfect son. He kept secrets that hurt me deeply, made choices that I wish he'd made differently, built a life I wasn't allowed to be part of, but in the end, when it mattered most, when he had to choose between safety and truth, between comfort and courage, he chose the harder path. He chose to be the kind of person who makes a difference, even if making a difference meant losing everything. I couldn't ask for more than that from any child of mine. None of us could. The phone rang on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after the 5th anniversary memorial. I was in the kitchen, making breakfast for Amelia before school, when the sound cut through the quiet. "Mrs. Hamilton." The voice was unfamiliar, professional, with a slight southern accent. "This is Agent Diane Crawford, with the FBI. I'm calling about new developments in the Atlantic Continental case." My heart stuttered. "What kind of developments?" "We've identified additional individuals who may have been involved in the conspiracy to silence your son." We believe the sabotage of his aircraft was ordered by people outside the company, contractors who specialized in making accidents look like accidents. We're preparing to make arrests, and we wanted to notify you before the story breaks. More arrests, more trials, more justice for Marcus. I sat down at the kitchen table, the phone pressed to my ear, feeling the weight of 5 years of fighting finally begin to lift. Thank you for telling me, I said. When will this happen? Within the week, the press conference is scheduled for Friday. We'd like you to be there, if you're willing. Your presence would send a message about the importance of what your son uncovered. I'll be there, I said without hesitation. I've been there from the beginning. I'll be there until the end. I hung up and looked at Amelia, who was watching me with curious eyes over her cereal bowl. Good news? She asked. Yes, sweetheart, I said. Very good news. The people who hurt your daddy are finally going to face justice, all of them. She nodded solemnly, with a wisdom beyond her years. Daddy would be happy, she said. Yes, I agreed. He would be. The press conference was held in Washington, in a federal building I'd never visited before. Valerie and Amelia stood beside me as Agent Crawford announced the arrests of 3 contractors who had been hired to sabotage Marcus's plane, mechanics with access to the aircraft, paid by intermediaries connected to Atlantic Continental's former executives. The conspiracy ran deeper than anyone had suspected, a web of corruption and murder that had taken years to fully unravel. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. I stood at the podium and delivered a statement I'd prepared the night before, my voice steady, despite the emotions roiling inside me. 5 years ago, my son was murdered for telling the truth. I said, today, the last of the people responsible for his death have been brought to justice. This is a victory for Marcus, for his family, and for everyone who believes that corporations should be held accountable for their crimes. But it's also a reminder that the fight for justice is never really over. There will always be people who choose profit over safety, who value money more than human life. It's up to all of us to stand against them, to speak the truth even when it's dangerous, to be the kind of people my son was. I paused, looking out at the sea of faces, at the cameras recording every word for posterity. Marcus once wrote me a letter, I said. In it he told me that the truth needed to come out, even if he wasn't around to tell it. He was right. The truth is out now, and it will never be buried again. After the press conference, Valerie and Amelia and I walked through the streets of Washington, past monuments and memorials, past the symbols of a nation built on the ideals of justice and accountability. Amelia held my hand on one side and her mother's on the other, a bridge between generations, a promise for the future. Grandma, she said, can we get ice cream? I laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd felt in weeks. Yes, sweetheart, we can definitely get ice cream. We found a shop near the National Mall and sat at a table by the window, eating our cones and watching the tourists stream past. For a moment, everything felt normal. For a moment, I could almost forget the years of grief and anger and fighting that had brought us to this point. But I didn't want to forget. Not really, because the grief and anger and fighting were part of Marcus's legacy too. They were proof that his death had mattered, that it had changed things, that it had made the world a little bit safer for everyone who stepped onto an airplane. I love you, Grandma, Amelia said, her face smeared with chocolate ice cream. I love you too, sweetheart, I said, more than you'll ever know. We finished our ice cream and walked out into the sunshine, 3 generations of a family that had been broken by tragedy and rebuilt by love. The future stretched out before us, uncertain but full of possibility. Marcus wasn't there to see it, but I knew he was watching. Somehow, I knew he was proud of what we'd accomplished in his name. And I knew that his story, the truth of who he was and what he'd sacrificed, would live on long after all of us were gone. That's what heroes do. They live forever in the memories of the people they save. My son saved thousands of lives, and I made sure the world knew it. The judge told me there were no survivors. He was wrong. We survived, all of us. And we made sure Marcus's death meant something. That's the only ending that matters. That's the only truth that counts. My son was a hero, and now everyone knows it.